Les débats autour de la censure à l'université sont devenus un sujet récurrent dans les cercles intellectuels de l'anglosphère. Si le phénomène a connu une éruption en intensité ces dernières années, comme documenté par le collectif CelestiC, il n'est en rien nouveau. En 2001, un brillant linguiste, Eckhard Malotki, spécialiste de la langue Hopi, était accusé par son propre président d'université d'avoir maltraité sujets et assistants dans le cadre de son travail de recherche. Une accusation sans tentative d'apporter des preuves, et corrélée à des accusations de racisme et d'impérialisme essuyées par ailleurs par Malotki pour avoir voulu parler de guerres ancestrales chez les Anasazi, à l'occasion d'un séminaire. Mon invité pour cet épisode, Norbert Francis, est professeur émérite à Northern Arizona University, et voit dans cet épisode un précurseur de l'affaire Brett Weinstein à Evergreen. Debates around censorship on university campuses are now a recurring feature in Anglosphere intellectual life. While this phenomenon has amplified in the past few years, as has been documented by Heterodox Academy, it is by no means new. In 2001, a first-rate linguist, Eckhard Malotki, Hopi language specialist, was accused by his own university president to have abused both subjects and assistants in his field work. The accusation was formulated without any attempt to provide evidence and was correlated to accusations of racism and imperialism thrown by other people at Malotki for having planned to give a talk about ancient warfare among the Anasazi. My guest for this episode, Norbert Francis, is Professor Emeritus at Northern Arizona University and sees in this incident a precursor to the Brett Weinstein affair at Evergreen State College. Well, I'm thrilled to be here with Professor Norbert Francis. Professor, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
You are now Professor Emeritus at Northern Arizona University, where you conduct your research in the Department of Education. Your research on language learning mobilizes cognitive science in the field of applied linguistics, and you are the author of several books, including Bilingual Competence and Bilingual Proficiency in Child Development, which was published in 2011, and Bilingual and Multicultural Perspectives in Poetry, Music, and Narrative, published last year in 2017. And in October of last year, you wrote an article called Postmodern Creationism in Academia, Why Evergreen Matters, which was published by Quillette magazine. And this is what prompted me to invite you on the podcast. So maybe we can discuss this article in some depth.
Mm-hmm.
Your account revolves on the academic censorship of Professor Eckhard Malotki, who is a linguist specialized in the Hopi language, and he has a very strong track record. So Hopi is a Native American language of the Uto-Aztecan family, just to provide some basic information on what we are talking about. And maybe to provide some background for the audience, you could tell me a little bit more about this researcher.
Well, if I could,
Yes.
let me tell you some of the background to my work that brought me to this question, because I've never really was very concerned with it until recently. The case that you mentioned was a case of a very prominent researcher at my university. He's probably the foremost researcher and scholar of the Hopi language.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when, this was actually some years ago, and I remember I was just beginning as a new professor there, and I work in the same area that he does, in the study of indigenous languages and cultures. And so it was an honor for me to be at the same university with him. I read his articles. He's very famous for clearing up a big misunderstanding about the Hopi language, that it was claims that because it was so exceptional in its culture that Hopi people didn't have a conception of time. And that was a famous claim at one time, and he cleared it up and showed that that was not true. And he's famous for that discussion, and also for his work in documenting the language. The language is endangered, and he's probably done more to document it in the form of dictionaries and also the traditional literature. But then one fine day, I'm reading the student newspaper at my college, and I see that there's a vicious attack on his integrity and his work by none other than the president of the university.
Mm-hmm.
A scurrilous attack on him, presenting no evidence for the accusations. And one thing leads to another, and he's basically forced into retirement. And there's a lot of details in it, but as a young professor, it shook me greatly. This was back maybe 15 years ago, and I publicly asked asked that the claims be substantiated, and no one ever answered me, and I saw also that I was the only one at the university to even have raised a question about what was obviously an attempt to discredit him and drive him out of the profession. And so that stayed with me for a long time, that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then most recently, the events at Evergreen College brought it all back to me. And that's why the way that Professor Brett Weinstein, was driven out also out of not only the college, but it seems now out of academia. Brought the whole scandal back to me, and then I started to study this issue more, and I found it very troubling. It's interesting that now we are almost a little more than 1 year, the anniversary, 1 year of the attacks on Professor Weinstein, and we all saw it on television, on the videos. It was quite dramatic. This kind of red guard, brown shirt persecution of a professor who simply had expressed an opinion on an important issue. And again, in this case, one thing led to another, where they literally forced him and his wife, who's also a professor of biology there. They forced them both out, and they are now over a year now without a job there, and they haven't been given an offer anywhere else in academia. That's sort of like the background to all of this discussion.
Yes.
At first, it doesn't seem related to the topic of the article about creationism, academia, but it actually is a very close relationship between these two problems, and maybe that's one of the points I'd like to touch on during that.
Certainly. Maybe before we discuss this relationship in more detail, we can, give some more information about the Malotki case, just to make clear what the accusations against him were.
Okay, well, without getting into the minutiae of the accusations, it's very, very similar to the Evergreen case with Professor Weinstein.
Okay.
There's an accusation made, okay, and these days, the accusation very often is sufficient to tarnish your reputation, and to trigger a whole series of events that can ruin your career, especially if the accusation is about what we would call one of the favorite or central concerns of student activists, people who want to exhibit their how should we call virtue, and cast a shadow on a person so that a movement can be generated around an issue of the person's alleged racism. This is a very common accusation, in fact, and it was an accusation in both cases.
Okay,
they're related. 1 year after the events at Evergreen College, it's clear that the U.S. academia, the academic system, has learned virtually nothing from this scandal. In the Molotki case, it was again an accusation that had no basis of his violating the rights, even suggesting that he had violated the human rights of the Hopi people.
Okay.
By things that he had written. And there was, and it came all to a crisis in the case of my university, where he had proposed and actually scheduled to do a public forum, which is common for professors to do all the time, on a case of the history of the indigenous people of our region there in the southwest of the United States. And it was a scientific question. It was a scientific question related to levels of violence and conflict in the ancient times amongst ancient peoples. And there's been archaeological evidence unearthed by a colleague of ours, in fact, also of Arizona, that had looked into this problem, this question about the level of conflict and warfare and violence amongst the indigenous people 10,000 years ago. Now, why that would be controversial is one would really have to wonder. There's been conflict and violence in all cultures, and if you go back far enough, thousands of years, the conflict and violence seems to us today to be extraordinary by our standards.
Yes,
but none of this should be controversial, but it caused a scandal amongst the administration, and this was a case of an actual suppression of free speech. I know that's the topic of your blog, and I'm really glad that you do this work because it's very important. And one of the things I would like to mention is that cases of repression of free speech or its the threatening of it take many forms. And so the form that I'm mentioning now is a direct censorship on the part of a state university that actually shuts down the speech of a professor or student. So that's one example, and you would consider this may be the simplest example. It's if the professor went to get a lawyer, he would win his or her case based on a violation of law. That's a First Amendment violation in our country, in the United States. And so it's a simple case of censorship in this case. But as we've seen over the recent years, the denial of free speech takes other forms too. And let's say in the case of Professor Weinstein, it wasn't a clear case where the administration publicly and outrightly censors him. Right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't a case where the president of the college took a decision to cancel a class of his or a meeting of his in violation of the First Amendment. But rather, it's more complicated. Other actors in the university seem to, how should we say, do the work of censorship in the place of the administration. So that's another case that maybe we could examine. And then there's other cases too where disruptive extremist groups take it upon themselves simply to use what we call the veto,
heckler's veto,
heckler's veto. And in some of these cases, there's no collusion or cooperation with the administration. So that's like maybe a third case that's interesting. Very often, the administration does nothing about it. It just sits on its hands and says, well, these are people acting badly, and maybe it's also their free speech right to disrupt a speaker's program, and they just wash their hands of the matter. But they were at no point colluding with the disruptors, which in effect did the job of censorship anyway. But then there's a kind of a legal gray area, right? The person was censored, but was there an illegal act committed? So it's a third kind, and then maybe there's some others. So there's here we have three examples of how in academia these days, freedom of speech or freedom of expression and freedom of discourse and discussion has been curtailed and threatened, and it's quite threatening. It's quite troubling. The Malachi case sort of disappeared into forgetfulness. It was before things got on the internet, and if you try to find it on the internet, you won't find any trace of it. So it's sort of no longer in people's consciousness or their awareness. With one exception, they ruined his career and vilified him, vilified the most prominent researcher of the Hopi language, and he no longer does research in his field. In the case of Weinstein, this is now, it's widely known what happened. It was covered extensively. And 1 year later now, we can look back on the events and over the course of the year and ask ourselves, have we learned any lessons from what happened? And then in the other cases, the same question we could ask. So I think our conversation, I think, comes at a good time.
Okay.
We can look back on I think the last case of this suppression of freedom of expression and ask what has been the outcome of it. To me, I have to say, from my point of view, it seems just very disturbing, and so I'm happy that you're giving this topic some airtime. We can talk about it because I don't think it's over. Despite the coverage that it received, it's the lessons have fallen greatly on deaf ears. And I'll just give one example of it. Maybe we can then go on to another topic. case of Professor Weinstein, it's really remarkable. Here's a very eloquent professor. He must have been one of the great, one of the best professors that students had there. And just listening to his talks on the internet, but it has to call our attention the fact that the venues where he has been able to discuss this case and its importance have been quite narrow. The mainstream media has generally ignored it. He and his wife have been very successful in going on YouTube channels, watched by many people now. And then in terms of commercial media, I have to say it's covered more by what we would call in the U.S. The more conservative spectrum of the political panorama, and to me it's greatly disappointing in that way, because the version of the events has not been clearly explained to most people, and especially professors and students in academia. It's there that the lessons have not been drawn, in my opinion.
Okay.
As far as I can see.
Yeah, I would probably tend to agree with you on this. Maybe we can move things to the second major topic of your article, which is the question of the scientific method in some fields of the humanities and the social sciences. So in your article, you write that as we speak, there is in academia so here I will quote you, there is a widespread acceptance of notions that oppose the conclusions of research on human evolution, particularly regarding the migration and dispersal of early cultures that came to populate the New World, so the Americas. You further write that this opposition has now become the dominant view in many departments of American Indian studies, indigenous studies, multicultural education, ethnic studies, and allied fields. So end of the quote. And collectively, you call all these fields cultural studies. So how widespread exactly would you say the problem is?
That's a good question, because I have to admit, I became interested in this very topic that you just mentioned because it's my field. I work in this field. I work in indigenous communities in Latin America in a project that has over 25 years working on these very not this. We don't research questions of genetics and evolution. We do other kinds of work. That's not the focus of our work, but I belong to this field. And so I found it surprising that a version of creationism, and I think we have to be honest and call it that, has garnered virtual universal support within this field of indigenous studies. Now, people will say, "Oh, well, this is a small field, and we're talking about very few people anyway." It's true; there are very few in North America. Very few. Indigenous communities are very small. They're far away from the urban centers. They're isolated, marginalized, discriminated against, and people don't give them much thought. And why is Francis making such a big deal about this issue that doesn't affect most people? And we could maybe just ignore it. But it's a, what would we call it? Like a sign or an index of a much broader crisis in science education in the United States and Canada as well, and in just in academia in general. So let me just answer your question directly. The one publication that is the most interesting in this discussion was a book published, I think it's over 15 years ago now. It's become a virtual bestseller in the field of indigenous studies and cultural studies by a famous author. He's known widely for his writings on indigenous cultures. Vine Deloria. He wrote that book, I can't remember the title exactly.
The version that I have, the title that I have in the Mayas now is Red Earth, White Lies.
Right, well then he writes Red Earth, White Lies.
Yeah.
In this book, he makes the claim that evolution, the theory of evolution, and the theory of the migration of humans throughout the world, and specifically to the New World, the Americas, is simply the imposition of what's called Western science. And it's interesting because his claims are quite extravagant and wild, and in some ways people don't take them seriously for that reason. However, this idea or concept of Western science has really caught on. You think about it, it's on the face of it, it's just simply incoherent. There's no such thing as Western science. But it's a hard concept sometimes to explain to people why there's no Eastern science, there's no Western science. It's just science. We are just a science. All of the discoveries belong to science. There's not an indigenous science or an indigenous knowledge that's special to indigenous people or to Germans or to Japanese people. Scientific discoveries are integrated into science, period. But this idea that there's a Western science, and in fact that this Western science has to be limited, or it has to be fought, it has to be struggled against in the case of indigenous people, has become very popular. Let me give you an example. Let's say in an indigenous community of the Amazon, where people have, the community has had no contact ever with outside other communities. It's entirely possible that there's individuals from that culture could make a discovery. They could discover some substance, a natural substance that has very beneficial properties of some kind that no one has ever discovered. That's entirely possible. What do we call that? We call that a discovery of science. The people who did that were contributing to science. They didn't contribute to Brazilian science or the science of their community. They contributed to science, and the scientific community would go to meet this person. They would work with him, and they would study the properties that were discovered, and then integrate them into science, if indeed the discovery was correct. But this idea of Western science, and that it's an imposition of the oppressor, has really caught on, in large part with his book, Red Earth, White Lies. It had been around before, but it really, the fire was lit with his book. And despite the wild claims about evolution, which are kind of crazy in it, the part was distilled from it was this idea of the pernicious effects of so-called Western science. And these pernicious effects are upon indigenous people, upon not just indigenous people, but other people who have been oppressed or discriminated against, who have suffered in some way historically. And so the culprit is this thing called Western science. And since then, there's been this spectacular success in spreading this concept. There's been many publications that have branched off from this idea. And they're very popular, not only in my field now, because it's a small field and who cares, right? But it's not only in my field, that in all of this, what we call this cultural studies is much broader, okay? That has been influenced by postmodernism. And you could see how the postmodern idea would latch on to this Western science fiction, this and it spreads. It has spread beyond these cultural studies departments. There are many. This cultural studies phenomenon is one with many. I don't want to use the word tentacles as a bad connotation, but it has multiplied itself in many iterations. It's studies of all kinds of things, women's studies and American studies. Those are kind of the traditional ones who started. Yeah. There's just cultural studies, and then there's science studies. Watch out for that one. That's a really one. Okay. Then there's studies of all kinds of things, right? And it doesn't have a fixed. What we call a fixed discipline to it. It's sort of part of this amorphous postmodernist mantra that has covered much of academia in the United States and in Canada. It's remarkable. It's remarkable how the popularity of this viewpoint has been so successful. Not only in these studies that I mentioned, but now in the traditional disciplines of the academy, history and sociology, anthropology. These kinds are very strong, if not in some subdisciplines, a majority point of view. In my faculty, which is education, it's hard to put an estimate on it, but it's very influential. And this is a traditional discipline of the university. Its task is to prepare teachers to work with children. And so here, this theory of going back to the book, Red Earth and White Lies, the idea that evolution is an imposition of Western science, and that the migration of humans to the New World is another imposition of this kind, is quite remarkable that it has been successful in implanting this fiction. It's a pure fiction. Just to take a little parenthesis, let me take a little water here. Just to take a little parenthesis on the actual science of this question. In archaeological science, in population genetics, there is probably no greater discovery in recent memory than the discovery and the final consensus of the origin of our humanity, of modern humans, that we indeed evolved, first of all,
Mm-hmm.
We share a common ancestry with the other primates around us. They are our most recent evolutionary cousins. And that origin has been geographically identified as Africa, Eastern or Southern Africa, from which modern humans dispersed throughout the world, including the New World.
Mm-hmm.
This is in the profession. This is an absolute consensus. There's still a lot of work to be done on the details, on the timing of the different migrations, intermixture with Neanderthals and other humanoid populations that were very close to us. All these are very interesting questions. And there are fierce debates over them. At what period did modern humans enter the Siberian region? At what point did they occupy the region around what now is the Bering Strait? And then when did they occupy and colonize the New World? There's all kinds of interesting debates about when. These were 30,000 years, 20,000 years. But there is no question, there is no debate on the major conclusion of genetics, especially now genetics. We've been able to take samples from human remains in North America that have now absolutely confirmed the finding of archaeology. So it's all confirmed, and it's one of the great. It's truly one of the great consensus of science, and it's one that's very important for us to understand, especially for studies of indigenous culture and indigenous languages. Where do we all come from? What does it mean to be human? What do we share as humans? You would think, if extraterrestrials once would come to our planet and visit us, study us, probably the thing that would puzzle them most would be why humans are so concerned about the differences amongst us. Because we are truly one species, one humanity. This idea of the oneness of humanity has been an idea that's been around for a long time, but it's really true in all its deep detail. And for now that in the cultural studies and then with the influence that they have, that now this is being challenged is very troubling. On the one hand, and what it does is it puts in jeopardy the scientific education of an entire generation of young people who have been affected by these postmodernist theories that entertain this possibility that that somehow the indigenous people, for example, arose in the New World somehow, independently from the rest of humanity. I mean, it's pure nonsense scientifically. It's pure folly, and the fact that the defenders of this point of view point to the oral tradition of and the creation stories of indigenous people, that has no bearing on the argument at all. It's simply a subterfuge, trying to confuse young people about what science is. It undermines the whole the education of young people about what the scientific method is. What is objective understanding of scientific facts mean? All of this is put into jeopardy, and that's why it's a troubling thing that we're so concerned about. And so it's not just a question that's isolated in just indigenous studies. It's been taken up by the broader. That's what's at stake, and the connection with the postmodernist alliance now with very bad actors in academia who have picked up on one aspect of postmodernist theory to suppress discussion is the second part of all this. It's very disturbing. So that's what's behind my concern.
Yeah.
As an educator, and when I see the point of view of science suppressed and disrupted, it's concerning. It's concerning in another way. The method of the accusation. Remember, we just talked about that. The method of the accusation, calling Professor Weinstein a racist for his objection to an activity that was, by all standards, counterproductive to its goals of more equity. But because the accusation was made and made it stick, okay, it completely shuts down all of the discussion. And this is repeated. This kind of method is repeated over and over, as we see inside the academia. And what it does, it casts a shadow and a chill, what we call a chill, over professors. Who, let's say, especially if you don't have tenure, who in their right mind, what young professor who wants to still have a career would stand up and defend someone accused of such a heinous thing? In fact, very rarely do people do that. It's old people like me who are tenure, or actually I'm Emeritus even now. I can say what I want. But in the case of Evergreen, out of a faculty of hundreds, Professor Weinstein reported that the number of people who came to his defense, just to defend his right to speak, numbered, I think, maybe two. Who were willing to publicly even say anything, much less actively defend him. And it resulted in he and his wife being driven out of a university in which they wanted to stay. They made an offer to the university for leave, to have things cool off. They wanted to work there, and it was refused. Forced into a legal proceeding. They had to settle for a monetary settlement, but that is not a solution. That is not a solution, and that is none of us should accept such a result for that was the result of the denial of academic freedom in this case. Much more than that. It was physical harassment.
Certainly, yeah.
Threats to physical well-being, which the university itself had refused to do anything about. It refused to defend one of its own employees who was under threat, physical threat. That's why they probably had to settle for a monetary settlement, because they knew they were legally exposed on that. Be that as it may, this is a pattern we see throughout the Canadian and American academia of professors put in this situation where they are compelled to to leave their appointment and try to find work as a public intellectual, writing books, or going on. I think you can make money on YouTube. I don't know, but it's not. This is not acceptable. This is not acceptable in a democratic society where this kind of happens. So, the success of the postmodernist extremists has been quite spectacular in these few cases that are extreme, but also in shutting down the discussion. Generally, professors have remained quiet about these very disturbing developments. That's a fact, and so it's something that we have to ask why that is.
So to take things back briefly to the book by Debierre, it really reminds me of Afrocentrism. I don't know if you are very familiar with this, but it's discussed at some length in the book High Superstition by Gross and Levitt. And I'm wondering, if it's still popular these days.
Well, you know what has happened. Here we have a case where young people in high school and in university, especially, and in particular, these are young people, let's say the indigenous young people, or young people from a minority group, okay, who have historically suffered discrimination in their education, and still do to this day because of inferior education upstream in the public school system. And so here we have this postmodern version of education making their academic preparation even worse, even lowering the standards again for this group and many others. Okay, and then there's another effect of the postmodern wave, and that is the one that you mentioned. And that is of resegregating education. Okay, where we have now we've compartmentalized for every ethnic or sexual group, okay, their own kinds of studies, and they're given names. And that's and what has happened is what's occurred is a resegregation of education. When I came to America with my family, this was many years ago, in the 1950s, we had legal segregation, where the schools were legally segregated in some parts of the country, in the southern states. And we struggled against this. Professor Weinstein makes allusion to this, that the tradition of the civil rights movement was to break down the segregation. The concept back then was separate but equal. We would separate the different ethnic groups and give them equal education. Well, we all know that's impossible. The very separation is the inequality and the degrading of the education that they receive. And so we struggled against that, and were very successful. With with identity politics today, aligned with postmodernism, there's now a resegregation of the academy, where with the safe spaces, there has to be a safe space. The safe space is where you don't come in contact with people from another group that are threatening to you somehow. And so what it does is it reintroduces the same defect of the segregation of the old times. It simply reproduces it now in a new form. So the case that you gave of these fantastic, ridiculous, unscientific theories that are taught in the case that you mentioned to African American children is a direct result, not of the old segregation, but of the new segregation. There's no check on whether these fantastic theories are true, because they're cloaked in some kind of theory of resistance to Western science again. And who will try to stand up to it, okay, and say, this studies program, whatever studies of this or studies of that, is perpetuating fiction. You will be accused of the same thing that Professor Weinstein was, and Professor Malotky was, and many others. Who's going to do that? Especially when an entire bureaucracy has been built in our academy that defends all of these programs. It's been another. The end result has been to degrade and to degrade even further the discriminatory inequality in our educational system. We never really solved it from the beginning. We made great advances and progress over the years of the 60s and 70s. With this new resegregation and compartmentalizing of the studies programs, it has reared its ugly head again, and we're seeing the fruits of it. So, for indigenous young people, they're being taught creationism. In African American studies programs, so some of them are quite good. I'm sure they are, and they avoid these unscientific theories. I know for a fact that's true. Because there are good ones, but some of these theories, some of these fantastic theories, no basis in science, have started to circulate again. They come from a tradition, a separatist, segregationist tradition that we have in the United States. It goes back to the 1920s, going back to Africa tradition. Martin Luther King and the civil rights movements fought against this tradition of segregation and separatism because we saw how destructive it would be. And now it's becoming more popular again. It's something of concern.
And just to be precise, not only are these non-scientific or unscientific theories taught at universities, they are also taught at the lower levels of education, down to the elementary school level, if I understand correctly.
Oh yeah, surely in high school they're very common. Because there's been a reproduction of this segregation, a new segregation, where there's special programs where it's happened more in the universities. Let me just give you a few examples. The program of what we call in the United States affirmative action, which was an attempt to redress the past discrimination. It was a good idea. It's still a good idea because we still have a problem of serious inequality. However, the good concept here was distorted to introduce the ingredient of separateness. So that, for instance, it's thought to be a good idea, for instance, to take the population of minority students and offer to them specially designed programs courses, or in other words, parallel courses separate from the other students. Okay, and they're given. They're very well funded with federal grants, and in fact, and indeed, the student composition of these programs within the university is all indigenous students, or all African American students, or maybe all women, or all Hispanic students. I think by law they don't exclude students from other ethnic groups inside, but that doesn't happen. Because they're designed explicitly to cater to a certain group. Well, look what happens. They become hothouses, bubbles, for these pseudoscientific theories on the one hand, and on the other, the parallel coursework is routinely and systematically redesigned so it covers less material in a less demanding way. I've seen this myself. I've spoken out against it in our Hughes University system. But you know what the accusation is when you point that out. I'm not going to say anything. Okay, You're accused. Don't you support these programs for young people from this disadvantaged community? What's wrong with you? Okay? And so instead of integrating the students with other groups and having the open discussion and having professors cross over and into and integrated within all of the programs, we've crossed over into a new era of a resegregation in a new version of the separate but equal doctrine. Okay? Anyone who's my age should be horrified, because we remember what that was. We remember what the effects of that was. And we remember how the struggle to do away with it was very costly in our country. And to see under our very nose, in our very own institutions, to see it resurrected is something of great concern to us. And so this precisely goes back to the freedom of expression. Professor Weinstein objects to this idea of resegregation. That's exactly what his objection was. There's a lot of confusion on reporting of what he objected to. He was objecting to exactly what I said. This idea of resegregating the academia, where people are separated out. Okay, and because he saw the same thing what I was just talking about. Accused of racism, driven out of his institution, and in the process silencing everyone else except maybe the two people who came to his defense out of like the 300 faculty members. So it's quite concerning, and I don't know. I think in the long run it will peter out. I think it will hit a crisis at some point, but the cost will be severe for maybe an entire generation of young people who are suffering a massive miseducation, especially in science education, but in the other disciplines as well.
I mean, one could argue that this model, so to say, is hitting a crisis right now. I mean, there is a huge pushback at the moment. You've mentioned the people who have sort of given a voice to Brett Weinstein. So there is a pushback, and one could say there is a crisis. But on the other hand, probably one can also say that it's not the first time. Also in the 90s, there was a pushback against postmodernism, against sort of academic correctness, for the lack of better words. There were the books by Gross and Levitt, which you mentioned in your Quillette essay.
Gross and Levitt was one of the first great pushbacks.
Yeah, right. But the 90s pushback didn't quite work. There is this sentence that I remembered from Christina Hoff Summers, who said that even though people who were on the side of objectivity and scientific accuracy and freedom of expression won the debate, the opposing camp, for lack of a better word, quietly assumed the assistant professorships, which is how they sort of slowly increased their influence in academia. So I guess right now there is a moment of, the conflict has been pushed to the foreground, but I don't know if it's going to resolve anything.
Well, I think you're making a correct observation that in this time the pushback seems more, how would I say, more visible. There was, the Alan Sokal expose, and it had a big impact, but it petered out. It didn't have a lasting impact. This time, maybe thanks to the new media that are covering that people like Professor Weinstein are able to use. Maybe this is an important ingredient. I've taken notice on how many downloads there are of some of the pushback programs of the pushback. It is quite impressive. I mean, they go into the millions of views.
Yeah.
Some of these is quite impressive, and I think it's a patient. It's a kind of it's a work that's necessary. We have to be patient. We have to continue to patiently explain what are the concepts and the principles at stake here. In the long run, this degrading of education won't last. It will crash and burn at one point or another. But I think we just have to keep the pressure on and just keep talking about it. Your podcast is one good example. I just want to mention for viewers to if they want more information on this to go back to your program that you had on with Zachary Greenberg from FIRE and Jacob how do you say his last name? Machangombo?
Machangama, I think.
On hate speech and blasphemy. I listened to them to prepare my interview with you. And so I'm heartened to see that there's honest debate going on. It has to, but however, it has to find a way to penetrate the mainstream somehow, because the mainstream media outlets have not picked it up. Like I mentioned to you before, the actual account and the lessons to be learned of the Evergreen debacle are mainly covered in the more conservative outlets. And the more what we call liberal here in the United States, they're pretty much staying away from it. They and ignore it. You'll see they try to give both sides sometimes. Here was the students who did this, who made this attempt to separate the different ethnic groups, and then on the other side was a professor who spoke out against an equity program. That's how it's framed. Okay.
Yes.
So who wants to defend a professor who speaks out against an equity program at his university? And so very often that's how it's framed in the mainstream media, which is totally incorrect. That's a distortion of how it developed. It was a professor who objected to the resegregation and the lowering of standards at his institution. That's what it was about, plain and simple.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that message hasn't penetrated beyond the internet media. The internet media has covered it very well. So that's at least a step forward.
Yeah, it seems to be. So I have reached the end of my questions. Would you like to add something before we wrap up?
I'd just like to add that, again, thank you for this opportunity. Just another plug for one of your other podcasts, the program Professor Plukros was very interesting.
Yes.
She had a very interesting analysis of, how the postmodernist thinking somehow transformed itself to later align itself with certain left-wing tendencies. I found that interesting because I remember in the old days, I actually studied Marxism, for instance. The old left, had nothing but scorn for postmodernism and all this kind of thing. We called it idealism. It was the worst. It was the worst insult you could call someone. But somehow there's been a way that the two, at least one part of the left, if you could call it that. I'm confused of what's left and right anymore, to tell you the truth. One part of the left has aligned itself with the postmodernist ideas to mix up a new concoction that's is very curious to tell you the truth. But her program was very interesting, so I recommend it to your listeners. That's my closing recommendation.
Okay, well, I cannot ask for anything better to have publicity from my from my guests.
Well, thank you again for having me and listening to my observations.
Thank you very much, Professor. I wish you good luck with your work in Taiwan.
Well, good luck with your podcast.
So thanks again and have a nice evening and weekend.
Yes, thank you. Good night.
Bye-bye.